Jarom, revising revision. Look at you guys. Good morning. Oh, wait, let me revise that. Good evening. My argument is on Shakespearean revision.
What? You mean like what people do to a Shakespeare play to make it more relatable?
Not exactly.
No. He's referring to when people edit Shakespeare.
Yeah, like Julie Taymor, Kenneth Branagh, Trevor Nunn.
Guys. Perhaps Shakespearean revision is not exactly the best way to label what I want to be talking about.
Okay.
A way to better clarify what? Oh, a way to better revise what I'm trying to say is that I'm examining Shakespeare's revising practices to show that the prevailing scholarship on the subject could use some revising itself. You see, in the last few decades, scholars have come to generally agree that Shakespeare revised his plays. With few exceptions, the efforts of Gary Taylor, Stephen Erkowitz, and Michael Warren have pioneered the belief, at least for the time being, that Shakespeare actively and systematically revised his works. As a result of their work, Shakespearean revision has generally come to mean that Shakespeare made careful alterations to his plays in an effort to bring each independent work to some literary end. What was once a revolutionary idea now has become the new orthodoxy. Although the research of these scholars was quite thorough, there is still much we do not know about Shakespeare's revising. But first, what really is revision? Revision to most is considered to be an alteration of an original. But what can be considered an original? Even Shakespeare's inspiration stemmed from the work of other artists, and those artists stemmed from earlier artists, and so on. Within this understanding, revision takes a primary role in idea development, as any work by any artist is a product of somebody's revising. Indeed, adapting, repurposing, amending, or altering the initial work in any way renders the work a subject of revision. Like a student who adjusts his essay based on his teacher's corrective marks, adaptation, repurposing, and amending all play parts in his revising. One could say he is adapting his initial essay to meet the qualifications of the teacher. Ralph? One could also say that he is repurposing as he shuffles the order of his words to better clarify the desired meaning. Amending occurs in this example when he makes any changes whatsoever to the text, context, or ideas within the paper. With such an understanding comes implied progression of whatever the work may be. An author revises in an effort to make a material more fluid, more understandable, more personable, more impeccable, etc. Some may argue, however, that not all revisions are progressive. Such subjectivity falls on the author of the work, or audience if the work is performed live. Where the single author has the power to adjust the work further to fit his design, the audience can only dabble in the possibility of change without sacrificing the perceived authorship of the work.
So, you're saying that our interjecting revisions to your presentation, if you didn't plan these interjections, are sacrificing your authorship?
Precisely. The effort of progressive revision, however, still falls under the category of progressive revision, in that if the author used the detrimental change as a means of workshopping the piece, he is learning what not to do. The question that I am posing here is, could Shakespeare have used such a practice of workshopping in the creation of his canonized plays? Many scholars approach the idea of Shakespeare's revising practices with a linear understanding, following the chronology of published variant texts. Whether the plays Hamlet, Love's Labour's Lost, A Midsummer Night's Dream, or The Great King Lear, one can evidently see a hand of revision within the plays from one published text to a consequent variant of the same name. Sometimes it may just be a similar name and not the same. Either way, this idea revises the conclusion that Shakespeare never amended his work, and if it were corrupt in any way, compositors, editors, censors, and others who had a hand in the transmission process would be the guilty culprits. Gary Taylor, in an attempt to illustrate this elementary conjecture that Shakespeare never revised, only then to refute it, said, I know of only two great creative artists who, according to orthodox interpretation, never revised their work. One is, of course, Shakespeare, and the other is, of course, God. My argument proposes that Shakespeare not only revised through this linear fashion, but revised horizontally as well, jumping from one play to another, workshopping ideas, text, context, and characters. This unique category of revising I will call play-to-play revision.
Okay, give us an example already.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we used a play like Much Ado About Nothing as a base for this analysis of revisions from play to play, a good start would be to look at Leonardo chewing out Claudio and Don Pedro for publicly disgracing his daughter. No, not so, villain. Thou beliest thyself.
Oh, gosh.
What?
Make it dramatic.
Yeah, you had the whole stage, remember?
Okay. Fine. No, not so, villain. Thou beliest thyself.
Use someone else.
Fine, Brian, would you mind? And make it dramatic.
No, not so, villain. Thou beliest thyself. Here stand a pair of honorable men. A third is split had a hand in it. I thank you, princess, for my daughter's death. Record it with your high and worthy deeds. 'Twas bravely done, if you bethink you of it.
What Brian just portrayed here was Leonato's ironic use of the phrase honorable men. This same context of irony in the phrase honorable men is found elsewhere in Shakespeare's work as well. In Julius Caesar, Antony gives his infamous speech upon the death of his friend and mentor Caesar.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise.
Okay. Everyone knows it already. Cut to the good part.
Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral.
Thanks, Kelly. In this example, both Leonato from Ado and Antony from Caesar refer to their adversaries, once allies, as honorable men. According to scholars, Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar around 1599, only to be published for the first recorded instance in the 1623 folio. As scholars also believe Much Ado's first appearance occurred a year or so previously, Antony's use of the adjective should, according to this theory of progressive revision, contain more complexities than that of the earlier line from Leonato. In addressing the possible argument that such comparative moments are not complex progressions, but rather mere coincidences, one must consider the in-context relations in conjunction with this established chronology. Leonato and Antony are both prominent figures in their communities. They are both suffering the great loss of a loved one. Both are addressing those they serve, and within the circumstances, both seem to feel the need to demonstrate distaste for the deed done while using sarcasm to express themselves. One may also note that their use of irony is echoed by the other in the description of their adversaries as honorable, yet giving consequent details as to why they are not. If these moments are indeed progressive, then there must be progressive differences as well. While Leonato is directly addressing the culprits of this distaste, Antony is playing a restrained political tactic in his famous speech by directing his comments to the people of Rome, the outer audience, as if to implore the audience for satisfaction and gain their support. With Shakespeare's constant incorporation of the audience in his shows, one may deduce that Leonato possibly overlooked this great resource of support, while Antony maximized on it. Within this simple comparison, Antony overall played smart politics rather than succumbing to the waning self-control of the fatherly Leonato, yet both still echo each other in word and in irony.
I don't know. It does seem kind of coincidental.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have another example?
Sure. Let's examine Dogberry's iconic Ask speech, where he says, "I am a wise fellow." Right. Josh, would you?
Sure. wise fellow, and which is more, an officer, and which is more, a householder, and which is more, as pretty a piece of flesh as any in Messina.
Thank you, that's good. As Josh just emphasized in the segment, Dogberry calls himself as pretty a piece of flesh as any in Messina.
Whoa, deja vu. I have heard this before in Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah! Take it what sense thou wilt.
They must take it in sense that feel it.
Me they shall know when I am able to stand, and 'tis well known I am a pretty piece of flesh.
Thanks, that's enough, Brian. As Brian and Kelly very adequately demonstrated, the similarity in the text is a statement that both characters make referring to themselves as pretty pieces of flesh. Operating with the understanding that Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet somewhere close to 1594, this moment of reoccurring material precedes Dogberry's reference in Adieu. Dogberry's line, then, according to my argument for play-to-play revision, is possible revising of the earlier Samson line. By looking at this comparison literarily and dramatically, character arrogance is displayed in both individuals at first glance, yet contains more layers in further examination. According to the Arden edition of Romeo and Juliet, Samson's joke consists of two parts. The first and superficial part is the reference to his looks. Whereas Samson speaks of his acclaimed handsomeness, Dogberry's beauty is self-proclaimed and comparative to the wide standard of Messina. The second part of Samson's joke is the reference to his supposed well-endowed genitalia. Knowing Dogberry's frequent use of malapropism, coupled with his comparison to the rest of Messina, however, gives this line even funnier layers than that of Samson's base phallic bragging. Dogberry mirrors the superficial layer of Samson's joke, yet the second layer, depending on interpretation, could be either a malaprop or genuine bragging. If Dogberry is indeed making an intentional phallic reference, then he is admitting to knowing the standard of male genitalia in all Messina. If he is not referring to his groin, he plays the part of the fool by quoting a dirty joke that he may have heard before without knowing full well what it meant. Either way, when confronting this comparison dramatically, the choices of ways in which an actor may deliver Samson's line in Romeo and Juliet expands and adds complexity as Shakespeare revised the line for Dogberry. With such a simple joke echoing roughly 4 years later in a different context, yet simultaneously carrying the same meaning, one can rightfully assume a method to this madness. Okay, sorry. Anyway, Shakespeare may have liked the joke and simply wanted to reuse it. On the other hand, he may have disliked the joke and wanted to see if it would work better in a different context. Maybe the audience didn't react the way he had planned. Any way it reads, the author readily revised the joke.
Wait a minute. Doesn't Shakespeare have something like this joke anywhere else? I know he does, I just can't put my finger on it.
I'm glad you asked. This joke is apparently revised further in the later published Twelfth Night, which scholars believe Shakespeare to have written around 1601, a mere 3 years after Adieu and 7 years after Romeo. In this next example, Maria and Feste, the fool, are conversing. You are resolute.
We got this.
You are resolute then,
Not so, neither, but I am resolved on 2 points.
that if one break, the other will hold, or if both break, your gaskins fall.
Apt in good faith, very apt. Well, go thy way. If Sir Toby would leave drinking, thou wert as witty a piece of Eve's flesh as any in Illyria.
Here Shakespeare has Feste reusing the joke in yet another context. This time, it is as Feste is making a joke of the joke itself, which is what Feste regularly does as a fool within the story of the play. Where the preceding uses were proclamations of their outlying beauty and or references to admired genitalia, this speaker clearly is not referring to himself, or even to a male character for that matter. The line is quite complimentary. In comparison to the earlier versions of the joke, Feste's line correlates more with Dogberry's, reflecting roughly the sentence's skeletal structure. The fact that both characters are clowns in their respective stories is worth mentioning as well. Looking at this instance dramatically, with knowledge of Shakespeare's previous workings with this joke, one may consider the regular reoccurrences of this moment to be proverbial. if it is indeed proverbial, by Shakespearean success deeming it so, or by some other general means, his revision of this joke could possibly dictate an original practice. If an actor were to pause briefly after "thou wert as witty a piece of," as if to imply the same direction to the male groin as the previous Shakespearean references, only then to qualify the recipient of the comment with "Eves," thus changing the angle of the joke for the female, then the dramatic application, if intended, would prove that Shakespeare revised in this fashion and for a purpose. Josh, would you mind?
Apt in good faith, very apt. Well, go thy way. If Sir Toby would leave drinking, thou wert as witty a piece of Eve's flesh as any in Illyria.
As Josh displayed in the pause, this midline correction echoes Dogberry's lines while adapting the joke for his audience, Mariah. By evaluating this joke in comparison to its predecessors and giving credence to them, one could decipher more performing options and greater understanding in the use of each subsequent joke. A further argument that this joke was progressing in its development would be the use of witty. In the two earlier versions, Samson and Dogberry described the flesh as pretty. This revision of words within this assumed popular phrase acts not only as a play on words, but of sounds as well. Mariah, the recipient of Feste's comment, seems deserving of the compliment with her previous clever retort, yet witty carries oral similarities to pretty, which mirror the structure of the initial joke, yet qualifies it for the new context, as Mariah's earlier comment was indeed clever. This converting a pretty piece of flesh shows a consistent popularity in the phrase as a whole, in which the manipulation of Shakespeare's players had to have played on.
Oh, witty pretty, witty pretty, witty pretty, witty pretty. Say that sometimes fast.
Witty, pretty, witty, pretty, witty, pretty, witty, pretty.
Okay, I think we got it. Thanks. A theory as to why Feste directed such a joke to a gender in which it did not apply was that Shakespeare allowed some characters to be self-aware. For instance, Shakespeare frequently writes in asides to the audience. In Henry V, he even acknowledges the performing space in the chorus line within this wooden O, thus referencing the globe. So if a pretty piece of flesh refers to the male procreative element, and witty, interchanged with pretty, echoes the phallic use of the phrase while adding another layer, then directing it towards a woman would not only play on the fact that he is a fool of the show, thus making fun of the joke itself, but that he is aware of the fact that a boy is playing the part of Mariah, being that this was a regular practice of Elizabethan theater. Understanding this type of revision in Feste's case allows those playing him to look at the character as one who wanders outside the bounds of the show. Overall, this example is but a small sample of this kind of revision. We all have experienced those Shakespearean deja vu moments, whether it be Beatrice's insulting Benedick in Much Ado,
So that he have wit enough to keep himself warm, let him bear it.
to Kate doing the same thing in Shrew,
Am I not wise?
Yes, keep you warm.
or Dogberry to Elbow.